Hey folks, good to have you back with me. I'm stoked you're here today, got a whole new tale to spin for you. So let's dive right in. I'm Mike, and for a solid 11 years, I was living what I figured was the dream life. I had my wife, Sarah, who I was convinced cared about me, a pair of awesome kids who made every tough day worth it, and a house buzzing with giggles and coziness. Back then, if you'd asked me, I'd have sworn I'd hit the jackpot. Thought I'd put together something sturdy and true. But life's got this sneaky way of flipping the script on you when you're least ready for it. Betrayal isn't always about someone stepping out. It can be about coasting through a fake reality without a clue. One day you just wake up and figure out that the world you poured over 9 years into wasn't ever really yours to keep. Plenty of you out there have been in a relationship, some hitched, some with little ones of your own. Maybe you reckon you've got your partner pegged, every nook and cranny. I was right there with you, thinking I had it all dialed in. Then this mess hit me, and I learned trust isn't just about warm feelings, it's about cold, hard evidence. No matter how deep you care for somebody, if they're stashing secrets, you're just drifting in a fantasy bubble. By the time I wrap this up, you'll see why I turned my back on the life I thought I'd always chase. You might start poking at stuff you never figured needed questioning. And who knows, maybe you'll catch a glimpse of how risky it is to trust without double-checking, like I did. Alright, let's get rolling with the meat of it. Sarah and I crossed paths back in college. We were both young, full of fire, and dreaming big. The connection clicked fast, like puzzle pieces snapping together. By the time we tossed our graduation caps, I was dead certain she was the one I'd build forever with. 2 years after that, we tied the knot and started from scratch, clawing our way up from broke grads to a family with a roof over our heads. Sure, we had our rough patches, everybody does, but I never once doubted the ground we stood on. Back then, if somebody claimed my whole existence was a house of cards, I'd have laughed till I choked. Truth doesn't give a rip about how polished your life looks or how content you feel. It just sits there, quiet and patient, biding its time till the whole thing comes tumbling down. One ordinary morning, I rolled out of bed with no hint anything was off. I had the day off work, and with the kids on school break, I figured we'd just kick back at home, nice and easy. Sarah had to head into her job. Hers didn't come with the loose schedule mine did, so it was just me hanging with David and Linda. I whipped up some breakfast for them, and we parked ourselves in front of the TV all morning, cracking up at cartoon gags and soaking in the chill vibes. Then, right around noon, everything flipped upside down. 1 second, David was sprawled on the couch, messing with his toy car, and the next, he crumpled to the floor, struggling to catch a breath. At first, I thought he might have just stumbled or was goofing off, but then I clocked how stiff his little body went, short, raspy gasps cutting through the air. Panic slammed into me like a freight train. I'd never seen him like that, and it shook me to my core. My hands were trembling as I bolted over, shouting his name, hoping he'd snap out of it. He couldn't even muster a peep back. I don't even know how I got my act together enough to snag my shoes and keys. My head was a total fog. I scooped David up, hardly registering how light he felt in my arms. Linda, glued to the scene with big, scared eyes, started bawling her heart out. She was begging me not to ditch her there alone. No way could I leave her. She's just a tiny thing who'd watched her brother drop out of nowhere. So I grabbed her hand with one arm, cradled David with the other, bolted to the car, and peeled out for the hospital. Every few seconds, I flicked my eyes to the rear view, watching him in the back seat, praying he'd keep breathing till we made it. The second we screeched into the hospital lot, I yelled for help like a madman. Nurses swarmed over in a flash, whisking David onto a stretcher and rolling him off while peppering me with questions. They wanted the rundown, what went down, how long he'd been like that, any health stuff I knew about. I stammered out what I could, but my brain was mush. I was pacing a hallway, gripping my phone, wrestling with whether to ring Sarah at work or hold off, till I had solid answers, not wanting to freak her out for nothing. After what seemed like forever kicking around in that hospital hallway, a doc finally came out and let me know they'd gotten David steady again. I let out this huge sigh, like I'd been holding my breath for hours without even noticing. But just as that wave of relief started washing over me, the doctor dropped something that twisted my gut all over again. He needed to pin down David's genotype. I scrunched up my face. His genotype? That wasn't something I'd ever really chewed on before. I'd always figured Sarah and I were both B, so our kids would naturally be B or O2. Basic science, right? Still, the way the doc said it, all serious and heavy, made me second-guess myself. It didn't sound like some throwaway checkup question. I told him B, but as the words came out, this weird unease crept up my spine. The doctor gave me a little squint, like he could smell the doubt wafting off me. He pressed me, asking if I was dead sure about that. That question clamped down on my chest. I'd never actually double-checked, just took it for granted. I started to repeat myself, but the words fell off, like they didn't fit right in my mouth. The doc let out a quiet breath, his face giving nothing away, then said they'd run a genotype test anyway, just to be certain. I didn't push back, just gave a quick nod. Sitting in that stiff hospital chair, waiting for him to come back with the results, I wasn't sweating it yet. No reason to, or so I thought. It was just a standard thing, a safety net. Then the doc strolled back in, clipboard in hand with David's results, and I was still cool as a cucumber. But when he looked up at me and said my boy's genotype was A, all calm and matter of fact, my brain hit a wall. I blinked hard. Those letters didn't click at first. I shook my head, insisting that couldn't be right. I'm B, Sarah's B, so our kids should be B or O, end of story. The doc flicked his eyes from me to David, who was tuckered out but holding steady on the bed, and said they'd run the test twice. Same outcome every time. For a split second, my mind just wouldn't catch up with what he was laying out. I'm no expert, but I remember enough from school to know to-be parents don't end up with an A kid. It's not how the math works. I asked him to triple check, my voice wobbling out of nowhere. He sighed, gave a nod, and said they could do it again, but he was confident the result was spot on. So they drew more blood, and I sat through another stretch of waiting, trying to talk myself into believing it was a fluke, maybe a glitch in the gear or a slip-up somewhere. But when the next round came back, it was the same deal. David was as, no question. I just stared at my little guy, his tiny hands clutching the hospital blanket, totally oblivious to the tornado starting to churn inside me. The doc must have caught the storm brewing on my face 'cause he piped up, real cautious, asking if I wanted them to test Linda too. I barely croaked out a yes. If this was some kind of mix-up, checking her would straighten it out. Another test, another round of pacing, my head spinning through every wild theory I could scrape together. When the results rolled in, Linda came up B. Part of me wanted to feel a wave of calm, but instead, this queasy knot tightened up. Why was David the odd one out? I racked my brain for any reasonable answer, but no matter how hard I tried to logic it away, this one thought kept looping in my skull, quiet but relentless, refusing to shut up. Something wasn't adding up, and I needed to dig deeper. Sitting there in the waiting room, time crawled by like molasses, my palms sweaty as I gripped my knees, trying to keep my breathing level. I'd already told the doc to go ahead with a DNA test, but now, waiting on those results, I wasn't sure I was braced for what might come. A tiny piece of me clung to hope that I was blowing it out of proportion, that this was just some weird medical hiccup with an easy fix. I kept it all under wraps from Sarah. No point stirring her up till I had the full scoop. Sarah was still plugging away at her job. After what felt like ages, a nurse finally strode over, clutching a sealed envelope, and passed it to me with this blank look, like she didn't know she was handing me a gut punch wrapped in paper. She just said they were my results and left it at that. I grabbed it, ripped it open, and unfolded the sheet inside. And bam, the world just froze. 0% paternity match. I couldn't believe my eyes. My vision got all fuzzy, so I scanned it again, figuring I'd messed up somewhere. Nope, it was crystal clear. Neither David nor Linda were mine biologically. My heart sank like a stone. I was crushed. I sucked in a shaky breath before punching Sarah's number into my phone. It barely buzzed a couple times before she picked up, her voice chipper but scattered, probably still hunched over her desk. I forced myself to sound steady, like nothing was wrong. A medical scare had popped up, I told her. I was at the hospital with the kids. She gasped sharp on the other end, her worry kicking in fast, asking what went down and if David was okay. I explained he'd collapsed, but the docs had him patched up now, tests still running. She didn't miss a beat, said she was bolting from work and would get there quick as she could. That was it. I cut the call short before I could spill anything else. If I'd lingered even a second longer, my cool would have cracked, and she'd have heard the wreck I was turning into. I slumped in that hospital waiting room, staring at my phone's dead screen, feeling this heavy numbness settle over me like a fog. Sarah showed up in under half hour, barreling into the room like she'd sprinted straight from the lot. Her eyes bounced around till they locked on me. Seeing David perking up under treatment, she let out this big, relieved breath, her whole face softening. She wanted the rundown. What happened? How's he holding up? I kept it flat and cool, saying the doc had just cleared him. He was steady now, doing all right. Her shoulders dropped as the tension melted off her. She pressed her hands to her face for a sec, soaking in the good news before swinging back to me. She muttered how terrified she'd been and suggested we head home. I gave a stiff nod. No spark, no flicker of feeling. She didn't have a clue the guy sitting next to her wasn't the same one she'd left that morning. I'd changed in ways she couldn't see. By the time we rolled into the driveway, David had conked out in the back seat, his head slumped against Linda's shoulder, while Sarah kept murmuring little thank yous under her breath, grateful he pulled through. I parked the car but didn't budge, just sat there, hands on the wheel. Sarah popped her seatbelt and glanced over, asking if I was coming inside. I shook my head, saying I needed a minute to myself. She paused, like she wasn't sure what to make of it, but didn't press me as she slid out, gently scooping David up while Linda shuffled alongside her. I watched them slip into the house, the door clicking shut behind them, and that's when the dam broke. My grip on the steering wheel tightened till my knuckles went white, my chest started heaving, and before I could clamp it down, this raw sob ripped out of me, then another, and another. I bawled like a guy who just had his whole world yanked away, 'cause that's exactly what happened. Years of lies had piled up, and now they'd crashed down hard. I don't even know how long I sat there in the car. Could have been a handful of minutes, could have been longer. Time just blurred into nothing. It might have been hours before I finally got a grip on myself. I swiped at my face, sucked in a big breath, and climbed out of the car. The time had come to face Sarah and get some answers. Stepping into the house, I noticed the kids were already conked out for the night. Sarah was in the kitchen, humming a little tune to herself while she scrubbed a plate under the faucet. I didn't ease into it with chit-chat. I just set the envelope down on the dining table and said we needed to hash things out, my voice steadier than the storm churning inside me. She spun around, drying her hands on a towel, her brow creasing with a flicker of worry. She asked what was up, and I locked eyes with her, swallowing hard. I'd have the kids checked at the hospital for their genotypes, I told her, keeping it matter of fact. Her expression didn't shift much, she just said okay, her tone breezy, though I caught how she straightened up a bit, like she was steeling herself. I took a slow breath and dropped the bombshell, David's AS. She blinked fast, thrown off, repeating it like she hadn't heard right. I said it again, firm but with this edge creeping in, Sarah, he's S, and that shouldn't add up since we're both B. Her gaze flicked sideways for a split second. She brushed it off, saying it didn't click, maybe a mix-up at the lab. I let out the sharp, hollow chuckle. I'd thought the same thing, so I'd pushed for a retest, and it came back identical. Her frown deepened as she said she didn't get it, asking what I was driving at, confusion lacing her words. My heartbeat kicked up a notch. I'd gone ahead and done DNA tests for both kids, I admitted, my voice tight as a drum. Everything froze right there. She stood stock still, her face a blank mask. I grabbed the envelope, yanked out the papers, and smacked them down on the table. She flinched at the noise. Her shaky hand snatched up the sheets, and I watched her eyes dart across the lines, her mouth dropping open in this quiet, stunned breath. Then she cracked. A choked sob slipped out, her composure crumbling fast. She whispered my name, her voice splintering, barely audible. I didn't budge, just kept my eyes on her, cold and steady. Tears started pouring down her cheeks as she reached out for me, but I backed off, dodging her touch. She muttered apologies, her head shaking like a leaf in a storm, swearing she regretted it through heavier sobs, pressing her hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. She insisted she loved me, repeating it like a lifeline. But I cut through it. I told her you don't hide the truth from someone you love. Don't let them build a life on quicksand while you hold the real story. Her crying kept going, her pleas piling up, but I was tapped out. Nothing she could say would patch this hole. I turned my back, brushed past her, and headed for the guest room, that house no longer feeling like any kind of home. The days after were a slow grind of pure misery. Sarah tiptoed around me, her voice hushed, her movements jittery. She tried keeping things normal, like the rug hadn't been yanked out from under us. She'd whip up my favorite dishes, jollof rice with crispy plantains, spicy goat stew, grilled fish spiced just how I liked it. The kitchen smelled like better times, like care, but it turned my stomach instead. How do you choke down food when betrayal's sitting heavy in your gut? At night, she'd tap on the guest room door, whispering my name, begging me to open up, but I stayed silent. I'd lie there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many nights she'd watched me pour my heart into those kids, knowing they weren't mine. Then there was the hardest part, David and Linda. I still tucked them in, listened to their chatter about their day, planted kisses on their foreheads. They hadn't done anything to deserve this mess. They were just caught up in it, pure and blameless, but every glance at them chipped away at me all over again. A week dragged by 7 days of quiet dinners, stilted small talk, and forced grins for the kids' sake. Sarah kept at it, trying to bridge the gap, hoping I'd soften up and let it slide. I couldn't muster it. One night, I perched on the edge of the guest room bed, eyeballing my suitcase. I wasn't mad anymore, just hollowed out. I got to my feet and snagged the suitcase, moving fast now, tossing in a couple of shirts, some jeans, my laptop, and the bare essentials. I didn't even have a clue where I'd end up. I just knew staying wasn't an option anymore. Before heading out, I swung by the dining table, grabbed a piece of paper, and scribbled the only words I could muster. I can't stick around for this. I adore the kids, but our whole life's been a sham, and I've got to bounce. I left the note smack where Sarah couldn't miss it, then took one final glance around the place. I flipped my phone off, scooped up my car keys, and stepped outside, didn't even peek over my shoulder. The next morning, I was at work, trying to keep my nose down and stay busy. Right before lunch, Sarah rolled in. I stood up just as she came barreling toward me, her face all blotchy with tears, like she'd barely bothered to pull herself together before showing up. Folks around the office started gawking, but she didn't seem to notice. She was a mess, begging me to come back home, saying we could patch things up and had to make it work. I kept my voice level, even though I was falling apart inside, told her there was nothing left to salvage. She was desperate, asking what she'd tell the kids, how they kept wondering why I wasn't there, not getting any of it. I let out a quick, sharp breath and said that was her mess to untangle now. She should have thought about that before spinning an 11-year web of lies. She shook her head hard, edging closer, hands stretching out for mine, but I dodged her reach. Her apology spilled out through sobs, insisting it wasn't meant to go down like this. I stood firm, telling her things were changed for good, that I'd never be able to trust her again. She sucked in air like I'd knocked the wind out of her, tears pouring faster, but it didn't sway me. I'd been gutted for a week while she'd sat on the truth for over a decade. I took a step back, said my goodbye, and walked off. A few days later, I had the divorce papers sent her way, just like that. The life I'd known was toast. So what did I take away from all this? First off, trust's gotta be backed up. Don't just hand it over blind. We're fed this line that caring about someone means never doubting them, but that's bunk. You can love somebody and still need proof their heart's in it. I never questioned Sarah, never thought to poke around for myself. I took it for granted the kids were mine, 'cause they called me dad, but I was dead wrong. And that cost me 11 years. Don't assume. Dig in. Verify. Second, love alone doesn't cut it. We're told it can bulldoze any problem, that if two people have it, they'll figure everything out. That's a fairy tale. Without honesty, it's just smoke and mirrors, like stacking a house on a shaky pile of sand. I was all in for Sarah, for our family, but that couldn't undo her choices. It couldn't wipe away how she stared me down for years and kept the real story locked up. Real love comes bundled with truth, respect, and trust. Strip those out, and you're left with nothing solid. Last thing, getting past this takes time, and I ain't gonna sugarcoat it like I'm over the hump. Those kids still cross my mind. I still wrestle with whether I did right, still jolt awake some nights feeling trapped in a bad dream. But I've learned some hurts run too deep to just slap a band-aid on and keep trucking. Some breaks don't mend, and that's all right. Certain betrayals are too heavy to let slide. Some folks don't earn a do-over, and sometimes cutting loose is the only path to patching yourself up. So here's where I toss it to you. Well, what would you have done if you were me? If you found out your whole life was built on quicksand, would you have stuck it out? Tried to forgive her? Held it together for the kids? Or bailed like I did? Drop your takes in the comments. I want to hear what you think. If this story got your gears turning or tugged at you a bit, hit that like, share it around, and subscribe. It helps more than you'd guess. Appreciate you sticking with me till the end. Catch you next time.